Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Solidarity in Diversity Conference. We hope you had a good break, lunch break. We'll give it about a minute so that others can join us, and those of us working on our Zoom connections and stuff can get a bit of time to join us. So please bear with us for a minute. Okay. Thank you again for your patience. Welcome once again to the Solidarity in Diversity Conference, hosted by the African Studies Group here at Melbourne University and Melbourne Social Equity Institute. It's my pleasure to introduce you Dr. Carlos Eduardo Morreo, who will be chairing this section on intervention. Carlos is the Institute of Postcolonial Studies Executive Officer. He is Venezuelan citizen living in NAM or Melbourne, writing on theory, economy, and politics. Carlos taught global political economy and critical approaches to development in the School of Politics and International Relations at the Australian National University in Canberra, where he completed his PhD. In Caracas, Carlos was a research fellow with the Romelo, my apologies, ladies and gentlemen, with the butchering of the pronunciations, Gallagher Center for Latin American Studies, a lecturer in social theory at the Central University of Venezuela and in political philosophy at the Andres Bello Catholic University. Carlos also taught within the political economy program in a newly created experimental University of Venezuela. Carlos, again, my apologies for butchering all the Spanish pronunciations. We are excited to have you here chair the section on intervention. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Franka. It's a pleasure to be here. It really is a pleasure to be here in this fantastic conference that the African Studies Group has organized. So as Franka mentioned, my name is Carlos Eduardo Morreo. I'm a Venezuelan citizen living in NAM, and my relationship with the ASG is mainly via the Institute of Postcolonial Studies, where I work as its executive officer. IPCS is very happy to be supporting the conference and other activities by ASG. So today we have a really interesting discussion, adding to this really interesting panel, adding to this discussion that started yesterday on solidarity in diversity. Today's three speakers will be speaking directly to this question of interventions, the sorts of interventions that are available to us. And I really look forward to, of course, hearing the three papers and also to the chat afterwards. I'd like to briefly acknowledge that we, acknowledge the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri and custodians of the Eastern Kulin Nation. We honor their distinctive cultures, histories, and aspirations of the Wurundjeri, but also, of course, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across this country. We stand with Indigenous struggles for social justice and empowerment in Australia and globally. So we have, as I mentioned, three speakers, and I'm just going to briefly, say something about them in order of in the order I have here in the program. So first we'll have now I'm having technology issues here briefly. Sorry about that. So first we'll have Akuch Anyieth from Trobe University speaking on decolonizing family violence intervention orders in the South Sudanese community in Victoria. After Akuch, we'll have Dr. Jess from Often Digital and the University of South Queensland speaking on Australian advertising futures, ostracism and barriers to including marginal voices in a cancel culture. And then to round out our panel, we'll have Dr. Matthew Mabefam from the University of Melbourne speaking on bounded solidarity, universal limits of expression, and activism. Each one, of course, will speak for 15 minutes. I'll keep the speakers, to the 15 minutes. I'll probably DM each one, send them a direct message via the chat when they've got about 2 minutes to go. And of course, if they move past the 15 minutes, I will try to gently interrupt their flow so that we can then have plenty of time to discuss. You've got the full bios of our speakers on the program, but I think it might be worthwhile to sort of say a few, to present some of that here before, as an introduction to our speakers. So the first speaker for today is Akuch Anyieth from Trobe University, and Akuch is a graduate researcher in crime, justice, and legal studies at La Trobe. Her research interests broadly cover masculinity, domestic violence, and the law. Currently, she's researching family violence intervention orders within the South Sudanese community in Victoria. Her work weaves together South Sudanese customary laws, pre-post migration experiences of South Sudanese families, and their adaptation of the Western rules of law in the diaspora. I'd like to welcome Akuch to come and speak to all of us, and I'll welcome you with some clapping. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Carlos. Am I able to share my screen?
Yes.
Okay, let me just do that. Can you all see my screen fine? Yes,
yeah, we can.
Yes, okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for the great introduction, Carlos. I appreciate that. Like you've mentioned, my name is Akuch Anyieth. I'm a PhD student at Trobe University. My research is looking at family violence intervention orders within the South Sudanese community in Victoria. But before I get into that, I first would like to acknowledge the traditional custodian owners of the land on which I work and study, the people of the Kulin Nation. I want to pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. I want to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and this was and will always be Aboriginal land. I want to express solidarity with the ongoing struggle for land rights, self-determination, sovereignty, and the recognition of past injustices. Before I get into the issues of family violence intervention orders within the South Sudanese community, I would like to quickly give you a brief overview of the South Sudanese people and their migration to their current new host country, which is Australia. So historically, South Sudan, before it became South Sudan, it was called Sudan, and it was one of the biggest country in Africa, according to the square mile. It has gone through two major civil war. One was ended in 1972, and the longest one started in 1983 and lasted until 2005. According to world research done by researchers such as from the United Nations and Human Rights Watch, this war has been declared to be the longest war on earth. It stops in 2005, and South Sudan went through a referendum process where they gained independence in 2011, making it the newest country again on earth. So during the war, during the second war, many South Sudanese had to move to the neighboring countries. They were displaced. And from neighboring countries, some of them had to settle in refugee camps. And from refugee camp, majority of them were fortunate enough to get humanitarian visas to the Western countries, such as the United Kingdom, United States, and Australia. So currently, existing literature around South Sudanese social and economic challenges and criminal justice research, there are some things that have been identified, such as the impact of war, poverty, and trauma. And within that umbrella, under that umbrella, research identified that the war, poverty, and trauma has really interrupted South Sudanese traditional practices. Many of them also lost loved ones, such as family members, displacement, which really increased the level of poverty and low socioeconomic condition. The majority of them had to depend on aid in refugee camp and in neighboring countries, which resulted in experiences of mental health and other health challenges. Now moving fast forward to Australia. Also, South Sudanese are facing a lot of settlement challenges, and that's what the literature identified. Those challenges, I've listed a couple here in dot point, but not limited to these dot point, but because of time, only picking on various areas such as gender inequality, language barriers, the encounters of foreign laws, since they come from a culture, a traditional society where the use of customary law is usually the main way of addressing matters to do with family and within individual communities. Also, there's a lot of experience to do with mental health. There's high rate of unemployment, substance abuse, issues of acculturation, being traveling at different speed within the family. When we look at the younger generation and the older generation, there's also a level of family breakdown. And as you probably are all aware, there's a level of racism, discrimination, and marginalization, as we've seen recently, not only in academia, but also in the media. So my first column and the second combined do sometimes exacerbate and increase the experiences or the perpetration of family violence within the South Sudanese community. So family violence being either physical, emotional, psychological, sexual, financial, and in this day and age of technology, it can also be perpetrated online. So perpetration of these forms of violence can sometimes lead to sorting protection from the law through legal intervention, such as family violence intervention orders, which is where my research is honed into. So before I go ahead and talk about what exactly I'm looking at within the family violence intervention orders, I would like to give you a brief overview of the various definitions family violence are known or defined by the law. So according to Victoria Legal Aid, it is a legal enforceable document that aims to provide a person, their children, and their property with protection. The order has conditions to stop the respondent, the perpetrator in this case, from using family violence against the protected person, meaning the victim. Depending on the condition, the law might require the respondent to stop the behavior, the violent behavior, in other words, not to contact or communicate with the protected person or get someone else to do it for them. Also not to go near the protected person or get someone else to do it for them. In other words, you can't get your friends to go and stalk your victim or to go and further carry out behavior or activities that are deemed to be unacceptable for you to perpetrate to the victims. However, looking at the definition and the various name the family violence intervention order is referred to can sometimes be a challenge for non-English speaking communities, because depending on which state or territory you are in, it is referred to using different names. I have two examples here, but not limited to. It's known as domestic violence in some other states. Some other states it's known as intervention order, protection order, family violence order, or restraining order. So you can see the challenges here. If a family was to move from maybe Perth or Alice Spring or Adelaide to Victoria, then they will have to relearn what they are referring to if they are sorting after these orders. However, as this is a Victorian study, I will be referring to the Victorian name, which is Family Violence Intervention Order. Why is it not clicking? Oh, okay. So what is the aim of my research? So my research is attempting to unpack the experiences of respondent and applicant, meaning victim and perpetrators of family violence orders within the South Sudanese community in Victoria. The second aim is to unpack these orders and to find out whether they are making how they are working within the South Sudanese community. Are they serving their intended purpose, or are they not, or are they really being misunderstood or understood according to the way the law intended them to be understood? I'm also unpacking the role cultural practices plays when navigating and negotiating family violence intervention orders, because like I mentioned earlier, South Sudanese families come from a very traditional customary law-driven society. So some of the conditions sometime in the intervention order, although intervention orders are a civil orders until they are breached, and then they becomes a criminal matter. So my interest is to really seek communities' understanding around not only the condition on the order, but what those conditions mean based on their own understanding and their own interpretation. And like any other research, the last aim is to obviously contribute to knowledge. It is also intended that this knowledge will inform policy, law enforcement, and family violence services working with the South Sudanese perpetrators and victims. So I have 4 main research questions that are based on the aim of the research. The first question is, what are family violence intervention orders serving the intended purpose as a form of intervention protection within the South Sudanese Australian community? The second question being, how do South Sudanese Australians navigate and negotiate family violence intervention orders in Victoria? And fourth, what role do cultural practices play when navigating and negotiating family violence intervention orders? And again, last but not least, how can these cultural practices be recognized and contributed to reducing family violence within the South Sudanese community? Come on, move forward. So the method I'm using, this is a qualitative study. So I'm taking a qualitative approach. My data is being collected through semi-structured interviews with the South Sudanese people who have experience of family violence, intervention orders or orders. Participants include males and females, victims and perpetrators. I have a big emphasis on also including perpetrators, as there's no victim without the perpetrator. And considering the historical context of what South Sudanese people have been through in Australia, it will be interesting to hear from the perpetrators around their exact understanding of what these family violence intervention orders mean to them, and what exactly is intervention according to their own understanding, and whether, once they understand the conditions on the order, are they compliance with the condition or not? And lastly, it's the cohort I'm looking at is from the age of 18 and above. There are no minors being considered. The approach that I'm taking a decolonial theoretical approach because legal forms of family violence intervention orders or prevention were designed under the philosophy and belief that people are independent and autonomous. In many cases, legal forms of family violence interventions feed into ideas of neoliberalism that disregard the context in which communities of color, such as South Sudanese, face intersecting challenges and systemic challenges. Like I mentioned earlier in my previous slides, that South Sudanese families are encountering challenges pre-migration and post-migration, and often those challenges are not put into full contact when we want to apply the law within the South Sudanese community. I also aim to take a decolonial approach so I can center the South Sudanese people's experiences and voices when we look at family violence intervention orders and the role that play within their community. Decolonizing the colonial rules of how family violence intervention orders are applied within the minority group, such as the South Sudanese community, and hopefully other minority group can take something away from the finding from this research. I'm also trying to challenge colonial ideologies and broadening our ways to think more holistically and to put community-driven in relation to community-driven perspective in relation to family violence in the South Sudanese community. And in conclusion, the overarching aim here is to hopefully, after the finding, is to reach common ground for a better system whereby the colonial ways of family violence intervention or prevention could work hand in hand with the South Sudanese traditional practices, because there is so much that both cultures or both ways of law and order could benefit from one another, as we've seen in research in Indigenous communities in Australia and in areas such as Canada. There has been areas where laws has been reformed to cater in Indigenous practices into the law, and we can see that working according to some of the literature that is being done in that area. So hopefully that we can get the two systems to work hand in hand to better the community outcomes and experiences of the law and family violence. Thank you. I think I am, where is it? So I'll stop sharing now. Is my screen gone?
Yes, it is. Thank you, Aku. That was fascinating. That was so well presented, so clearly articulated. It should make it much easier for all of us to sort of engage in the discussion. And I'm thinking that the best way to do this might be to sort of go through the three presentations and then to return to the discussion at the end. I think that kind of gives plenty of opportunity for cross-referencing and to have a kind of a livelier discussion. So having said that, I think we could move on to our second presentation scheduled for this panel, and that's with Dan. Dan, I'll give you a second to prepare yourself while I read while I share your bio with everybody. So Dr. Dan Jess is a strategic ambidexterity in marketing expert. He's an associate professor at the RAND Institute and CEO of Often Digital. He's also the chief editor of the newly formed International Journal for Inclusive Advertising. He's based in Brisbane. He's a sessional lecturer at various universities as well. And it's a pleasure to have you down here speaking on Australian advertising futures, ostracism, and barriers to including marginal voices in a cancel culture. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that awesome introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully everyone can hear me nice and clearly. I tend to be fairly loud. Excellent. All right. As Dr. Morreo mentioned, I'm Dan and I live in Brisbane. I do quite a few different things, but they're all within the marketing sphere. And I'm going to talk to you today about a study that we've conducted up here on a national level in advertising agencies, which is quite relevant across a range of different communities. So before I get started, I guess I'll just quickly talk to why I chose this topic as a paper in the first place. Inclusion in advertising has a whole range of benefits, but it also, unfortunately, when it's exclusion centric, brings about a whole heap of different social justice and health issues. And so we also have a persistent situation in the industry, even for seasoned practitioners, that really struggle to grasp how best to include people on a daily basis in advertising. And there's quite a few gaps in the literature, but thankfully we have a lot of participants that were willing and able to be involved in the project. Just a little bit of background about the industry. I won't bore you to tears. The Australian industry in advertising is actually quite well advanced, and in comparison to other Western cultures, we actually do a fairly good job of regulating it, but we are a self-regulated industry. And because of that, we actually have quite a few failures in the industry that have led to very slow change, a lot of very slow improvements, and quite a lot of unethical conduct over time as well. But the majority of growth in the industry has been seen from 1960 onwards, and that's mostly from economic shifts, but also from technology. And if you think about Facebook and even TikTok and other social platforms, we've really been able as an industry to commoditize or to create a product out of those audiences to better target them. And that should, in theory, mean that we have better access to include more people. But as we've seen, we don't do that very well. We contributed last year, despite the pandemic, about 15.7 billion Australian dollars towards the GDP, and that's spending on advertising as a full nation. And there's just over 8,300 ad agencies in Australia. So it's a sizable industry. And it made me wonder, with all of these freedoms that we have and all of this self-regulation, why are we still getting it so very wrong? So we looked at marginalisation in Australia to begin with from quite a broad level. And marginalisation is a very encompassing term, and it captures ostracism as well as discrimination. We know that Australia is heterogeneous, so very multicultural nation, not necessarily very well integrated in some areas, as we've seen in other presentations today as well. And we know that ostracism and discrimination lead to poor health outcomes, both from a mental and a physical perspective. So it becomes quite important from an advertising perspective to be able to include people to avoid those kind of negative outcomes. In order to tie the two things together, we looked at trust, which in advertising is really important, because if you don't trust a brand or a person, then you tend not to buy from them. And trust is very much a bridging mechanism between people, places, even concepts and ideas, which is quite an important thing to keep in your mind as we go through this for now. Collectivistic cultures such as the LGBTIQA+ community very much place a general higher value of feelings on belonging to the community that they're a part of, and belonging to something in general, and also have a really narrow system of trust. So as an industry, we've kind of got to acknowledge that when we breach that trust by ostracizing people or excluding them from coverage, it actually is a paradoxical reinforcement of all of those negative things that we don't want. And they actually cost money, but they also have emotional cost, and they cause distress within the community. So that's really important for advertising to acknowledge. And I don't think we're there yet as an industry. In order to get where we wanted to go, we had to actually create a bit of a definition around cancel culture. So I'm sure you've probably heard of it before if you've read the media here in Australia. In America, if you're from there as well, also quite important. It does have etymological origins. So the naming origin from African American culture goes way back. And the precursors were blacklisting and boycotting of brands when someone wasn't happy. I've taken on a bit of work from Bouvier and Clark here to pull together a very long definition, and I apologize for that, but it is all encompassing. The cancel culture is a performative phenomena. So we're studying something that people actually do and are involved with. And it's an expression of individual or collective agency, where a person, a place, or a thing is identified, and then they're ostracized or even shamed and castigated because they exhibit values, attitudes, behaviors, or speech that are considered so very offensive as to warrant complete social disinvestment from them. And it's a socially mediated process, but it's also a kind of informal social justice. And to put that in context, because it's a lot of words that tend to not mean a lot of things when you think about them quickly, here's two examples from Australian cancel culture of recent times. On the left, we have Dr. Stephen Hagan. He's an Indigenous rights activist, an academic, and a CEO up in Townsville. And he was very instrumental in having the Coon cheese brand renamed into Cheer cheese, something that was considered far less offensive, of course, or completely inoffensive now. And he also started a dialogue around changing Paul's Smart to White, because that's considered an offensive brand name by the community as well. Then we flip over here and we actually have an Italian brand in Barilla, which is a pasta company, and everybody loves pasta. Not everybody, most. But Barilla did a really bad thing. Their chairman came out and said, I would never do a commercial with a homosexual family in it. It's not because we lack respect for them, but because we don't agree with them. Ours is a classic family where the woman plays a fundamental role. So he did not only castigate the LGBTIQA plus community and all of their adherents, but also women pretty much globally. So he did a very good job of annoying a lot of people. They, however, have recovered, haven't changed the brand name, and have simply changed the way that they approach their advertising. So for this study, we approached it from a two-phase step across 3 months. The first thing we did is we looked at a bunch of ads across different kinds of publications, and we did this to ground the study for validity purposes. There's really not a lot of literature out there in advertising industry in Australia, let alone in this specific area. So we needed to make sure it was fundamentally an issue that actually exists, and it does. Phase 2 involves semi-structured interviews and thematic analysis. And we really tried hard to adopt a pragmatic, problem-based approach so that we could really create something that would be useful as a useful set of interventions for the industry to walk away with. The participants that we recruited, and I'll talk about numbers shortly, but they're all from Australian agencies, and they're all in full-time roles and from socio-culturally diverse backgrounds. So we got a good sample. In phase 1, we took 236 ads, and they were blended from digital ads in video or a static image, or analog formats, including TV and print. The reason we broke them down into subgroups is to create a little bit more of a better or stronger representation across the country, but also in terms of those formats, because in advertising, they kind of are the separating grain. All of the ads we looked at were recent, so within the last 2 years. And then we used quantitative content analysis methods. So we've adopted kind of a mixed approach to research methodology here. And we created a set of codes and a code book to evaluate those ads to look how many times, so frequency of how many words came up that were in relation to a marginalized community, or an image or a depiction or an idea of that community. And from that list and that set of numbers, we then tried to make some inferences and had an external reviewer come in to make sure we're not going mad. What we found is this in this first phase. There's two kinds of contents that come out of artifact analysis as a rule, manifest contents and latent, which are a bit harder to see. They're not straight up and down. What we found was just over 61% of ads had zero representation of any marginalized person or community in them whatsoever. And this is quite a significant sample size too. We had 16% roughly included people of color, and that's a cumulative number. So we didn't look for specific races or identities, for example. Just over 5% for LGBTIQA+, and over 8% for disability, much lower for poor people, if you would put them in a bucket, and 0% of intersectionally marginalized persons were identifiable. That's, if you're not sure what that means, that is someone who may be both of Asian heritage, but is also poor, or of Asian heritage and identifies as a gay person. So having more than one factor. That's quite concerning for us, because in our industry, we like to think that we're actually quite a diverse bunch, and it turns out that we're not very good at doing it. Latent contents, we found that just over 2.5% of First Nations Australians were included in ads, and they weren't done very well. They were never included overtly. It was always just sort of alluded to. So that's why it's a latent content. And they were all tourism ads. None of them were for retail or anything like that, which is quite concerning too. And 0% of ads, thankfully, were not overtly discriminatory as according to our analysis, but we may then ask the question, I suppose, are we indirectly being discriminatory simply by omitting or excluding people? It doesn't have to always be overt. And that brings us to phase 2. So we identified in phase 1 that there was a problem, that the ads out there aren't doing a very good job of being representative of our communities that are marginalised. And then we took 62 individuals from different agencies from around Australia. They were from different sized agencies, different geographic locations, and they were randomly selected from a pool of just over 1,200. And then these are the ones that came good and sort of have submitted a sufficient review for us to transcribe. We took the unstructured data and processed it 2 times, both manually and using NVivo, which is software that you can use to chunk down structured content into something that makes a little bit more easy meaning, and you end up with a bunch of codes. So the codes that we came up with are all on the left side. The codes are representative of different frequencies of conversations that people keep bringing up from that 62-person sample. And a lot of the time they came up with things like, it's our decision, we're the agency, the client doesn't want it, it doesn't fit our audience. But then there were complaints that were a little bit more, I guess, unforeseen, things that we didn't expect as being there. And that was, I'm not sure how to properly represent people of marginalized communities. I'm worried that there's a risk to the brand I'm working on if we align with a negatively perceived community, and also worries about their campaign performance, which then has commercial on-flow effects for their clients. So we then organized those themes, that was a big job, into these 3, and we came up with innovation. So innovation directs around the creative process and also how you can use what you've got to create a great ad. And also the resources. The resources are things like people, time, money, technology, and so forth. And the last one was reputational. People seem to be worried in agencies about how they're going to be perceived if things go pear-shaped, or if they do something that steps on the wrong toe. The hardest part of this entire job was trying to put this into a bucket that actually makes sense. And now on the global theme, this is the top overarching theme that you always try to land to with this kind of research, and you can't always. Strategic ambidexterity does fit this fairly well because it involves innovation and creating something new while managing your business day to day. So this is the definition of strategic ambidexterity by the 2 guys in America that pretty much founded the concept. It really is about running your business ongoing and finding new ways to do exciting new things and being incrementally innovative so that you create new competitive advantage and longevity for the business. Lots of businesses out there do that really well. Apple is a great example as a technology company, but for some reason in Australian agencies in advertising, we don't seem to be doing a very good job of that. I just want to share a couple snippets of, and it's a bit small, sorry, but a little bit of information about what came directly from the interviews. In the innovation sub-theme, we found people said we're not very innovative. I don't reckon we've ever used a disabled person or a person of colour. Used was an interesting word, I thought. If the client doesn't ask for it, we don't really think to do it. We make creative decisions for them, but sometimes we have to mute or tame down our work just to keep the client happy. And this client, this agency said, we bend over backwards to educate our clients on why it'd be great to diversify their image, but they don't seem to want it or get it. And then there was the resources one, which is quite interesting. We found also that people just said outrightly, it's not our job as an agency to be inclusive. We don't need to be inclusive. They're doing it from a HR perspective, but don't acknowledge it that they want to do it from an ad side. Someone said outrightly, there aren't any good Aboriginal models. Which is also fundamentally incorrect, but it's an interesting perception. Most of the time, our clients only pay us to target one group at a time. That's quite common in agencies. And others said we just don't have the capacity to try new things because we don't know if they'll work. And then finally, in the reputational sub-theme, this for me was quite confronting because I think agencies should be much more brave, but they're saying that they're not allowed to make ads with marginalized people in them because their boss will yell at them. And this is obviously someone in a potentially junior or intermediate role. They said at this agency on line 2, we always aim to be inclusive, but sometimes it's just not possible. And that's probably fair. This person couldn't remember the last time they were inclusive in any community in their ads, and they've worked in that agency for 17 years. This person said, if we're promoting luxury beds, we'd never ever put a wheelchair in the ad, a person with a wheelchair, because they don't buy those beds, they buy different beds. And the last person here referred to Coon Cheese's crisis and simply said, Who wants to deal with that? Insert expletive. So the barriers that we came up with to inclusion, and we're getting to the pointy end of the conversation here, are socio-cultural competence, if I can speak English. People seem to lack the ability to speak between themselves, to communicate, to work effectively across cultures in agencies. There's very much a deeply embedded prejudice still, and the literature does support this. I haven't included references, but it is there, being applied in practice environments as well in Australia. Some of that comes from practice norms. Some of it comes from lack of motivation for wanting to change as well. I think there is a real fundamental issue in agencies of the smaller size where they don't have the resources and skill and quite a low risk appetite. That's probably more the smaller side. And then there's also a fear of unforeseeable crises. It's going to cause distress and failure for my business. What do I do? And then opportunities and not having autonomy to use those opportunities when they do arise are there too. And I'm coming to the last slide. So those barriers are pretty self-explanatory. They make sense even when you say them out loud in your own head. So what can we do as an industry and to make it better? I don't believe that a quota-based system will ever work. I'll just be upfront and say it's not like a board for a corporation where you can say we need to have 3 women at least. The advertising industry is creative, it's just not possible. So I've suggested that we educate and inspire agency leaders as best we can through work-based training programs to try and create, I suppose, more of a link, or like Akuch said before, a connection between people and place and ideas, so that people start to understand what it's like to work together. Then they need to create tools for action within their agency and also meaningful corporate identities that they actually live on a daily basis, that this becomes part of their praxis. Reflective practice will assist with that, both at the individual and cohort level. And finally, there's some points there about peak body advocacy and also creating forums, which would be part of that, I think, to foster ongoing dialogue, just to open up new resources, I think, because there's not a great deal out there at all. And the final point here, coming to the end, is a support mechanism or a program to guide agency leaders. And maybe one day, if I ever have another, 10 hours a day, I'll build something that helps them obtain, I suppose, more leadership skills to take away some of that strain that they're clearly worried about in being not able to run the business and also be innovative at the same time. So that is me. I had talked very quickly because there's a lot of words, but I hope you enjoyed it and you can ask any questions you want at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. That was very interesting. Really, really insightful. Once again, I look forward to the discussion in a little while. Here's a digital clap. So to round out today's panel, we have Matthew Mabefam from University of Melbourne, and he'll be speaking about bounded solidarity, universal limits of expression and activism. Let me quickly pull out Matthew's bio. So Matthew Gmalifo Mabefam is currently a tutor at the University of Melbourne, a visiting fellow at our institute, at the Institute of Postcolonial Studies, and a diaspora fellow for African Research and Impact Network. He was also the convener for the African Studies Group from 2016-2019 and continues to play an active role in the group. His research focuses on the politics of international development, political economy, migration, and well-being. Matthew also engages in development consultancies, is involved in community-led initiatives and sits on the board of various philanthropic organizations. He obtained his PhD in anthropology and development at the University of Melbourne. Thank you, Matthew. You're welcome to come and speak.
Thank you, Carlos, for giving the opportunity to speak. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and for giving the opportunity to work and live here and to participate in this conference. Thank you very much. Before I start my presentation, I think I'd like to position myself on my co-author. So this is a co-authored project that I'm doing with my colleague Kennedy Mbeba. And it started off by invitation from the Institute of Postcolonial Studies and the Demos Journal to submit an issue on precarity. So that was how it all started. So in thinking about what project I could present as a contribution to the journal's request, I thought about precarity in different dimensions. But one of the things that struck me was in our quest to act in solidarity, what are some of the things that actually serves as a limitation to that quest, and how can that either prevent people from engaging in causes that they think they're the right thing to do, and as a way of expressing their fundamental human rights, and there's some of the dangers or troubles that they could get into as a way of expressing in those their ways of life. And that fits neatly into this conference, but I'm just calling us to rethink about solidarity and whether when we are seeking to act or intervene as an act of solidarity, what might be some of the challenges that we are likely to encounter, and how might we rethink our ability to either engage or disengage. So that's where I'm coming from. So broadly, as I said, this is an extension of a paper that we published with Demos Journal. And the earlier paper was titled The Politics of Silence and the Precarity of Political Dissent. And we're going to build on that paper. So by way of presentation, this is my outline. The first thing I will look at is to unpack some of the key terms that I'll be using in this presentation. The second thing I would like to look at is looking at ways of expressing solidarity. The third thing is to look at some of the factors that, whether at the individual, global, or group level, people need to consider before they act in solidarity. And what are some of the limits when people are trying to express and engage in activism as a form of what expressing or acting in solidarity. I would also present one case study to illustrate these conceptual things that I'll be talking about in my presentation. And then I would go on to conclude. And so by way of structure, this is the way I'm going to engage in this presentation today. So one of the things that I've always been told is to speak up when you see that there's something that is not right. And when you do that, you are a good citizen and you are acting in the right way. And as you can see in this picture, which is just demonstrating people speaking up when there are issues that they feel it is not right. And as you can see, the human rights champion, he even quotes well, and he says that if you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have a moral obligation to do something about it. So if you see something that is not right within your society, within where, and you are convinced that this thing that is happening is not right, then you have an obligation to actually speak up as a way of supporting the cause. But what happens when people speak up? When they feel things are not right? What happens when there are different understanding of what is right and what is not right? And that is what my presentation is going to unpack, and some of the limitations. My next slide, I will talk about unpacking some of the key terms. And the first key term I want to talk about is sovereignty. And with sovereignty, I'm looking at it in the global scale. And every country is sovereign, or most countries are sovereign. And that actually means that they have the power to rule themselves the way they want. The government of that country has that power and authority to rule its citizens the way it wants. So when we are acting in solidarity, which some of the issues are transnational or they cross boundaries, how does the issue of sovereignty actually play out in these activities? And I should also mention that there are two spaces that sovereignty and our ability to express our activity as a form of solidarity may play out. Before the digital era, we used to have the physical space where we know the geographical boundaries of each country and what could be done in that country or outside of that country, and the boundaries or some of the limitations that come as a result of that kind of physical activity within the country. But within the era of digital era, the space has broadened and there's now fluidity, and whether the sovereignty of the country extends to its citizens in diaspora is also a question that we have to rethink. And what are some of the limitations that come as a result of this? Now, expression, as I would go on to unpack later in the presentation, it's just simply various ways in which people express how they feel about a particular issue. So for instance, if you are acting in the form of solidarity with a particular issue, there are various ways that people can actually express that. I'll speak about it later on, but I just like to touch on it a bit here. So what ways that we express ourselves can actually be limited? These are some things that I'm going to express or unpack later on. Now, solidarity, as we know, it's a very nice word. It's a very nice concept that even for the fact that this conference organizers are organizing this conference around solidarity means it's something that we're actually very deeply convinced about. It's a good thing to do. But in us, we actually act in ways that is actually demonstrating our solidarity. What happens? What are the limitations? And to phrase it differently, and taking these three concepts into totality, the question I like to ask, are these concepts bounded or unbounded? Do they have limitations or they do not have limitations? And they are universal and they can be applied anywhere without recourse to any consequences. My next stage would like to examine ways that people actually express solidarity. And as you can see, there are various ways that people actually express solidarity. This is not an exhaustive list, but I just feel like these were important to highlight. One of the ways is to demonstrate or to engage in a protestation. And as we have observed in this global community, there are several instances that people have acted in solidarity by going on demonstrations. We can see the Black Lives Matter movement across the world, even though they take different shape and form in different countries. People protested around the world as an act of what? Solidarity. The next way people actually express solidarity is in signing petitions. And I'm sure all of us, or some of us might be familiar on a daily basis. We have seen people send out asking for signatures at the end of a letter to actually gather signatures to show that this amount of people or this number of people are actually against this particular issue, or they are actually in support of this particular issue, and they are penning their signatures to actually demonstrate how they feel. And that is also an act of what? Solidarity. We also have one that people would write letters to influential people to actually stop an action that they feel is not the right thing to do. And a typical example is what is currently happening at the job cut at the University of Western Australia. And there's a groundswell of people who are actually sending letters to the state governments, individuals who are influential to actually rethink about that position, or talk to the universities to consider that position of cut down social jobs over there. There are also instances that people actually engage in strikes. They will not do anything. Some of these strikes, people might be wherever they want. Some people might also go to work. And if that issue that they're actually acting in solidarity or they think it's not a right thing, they might actually go to work but will not do anything. There are very few instances of extreme measures where people go on even hunger strike as a way of expressing their support for a particular issue. And finally, in this presentation, I also think that people actually also act in solidarity when they organize rallies and speeches to actually send home a message that they are not in support of something or they are in support of something. And that is also a way of acting in solidarity. As I said, this is an exhaustive list, but I just felt like these were very important for me to highlight in my presentation. I like to talk about what do people need to consider when they are acting in solidarity in support of a cause. There are various things that people need to actually consider, whether consciously or unconsciously, these things would play out in what they actually, as a way of actually moving ahead to either support a cause or not. And sometimes, yeah. So the first one I would like to talk about is your conscience and morality. As I mentioned earlier in the quote, he said that it's a moral obligation on the part of everyone to actually speak out when you feel something is not right or something is wrong. So if people believe that within their conscience, what they are going to do, which might either be either by themselves or an act that is affecting somebody, and they think that that particular way they're actually in line, or they are thinking, it's actually thinking that that is the right thing, and they would act or move ahead to actually support that cause. The second thing people actually take into consideration when they act in an act of solidarity is to rethink about their status of wherever they are, their citizenship, their status in whichever country they are staying, whether they are students, whether they are refugees, or whether they are asylum seekers. These all play a role in people thinking or making that position, whether they want to move ahead to actually engage in an act of solidarity or not. And I'm using this very carefully. Sometimes some people might not go to use some of the things that I stated earlier due to obvious reasons, and not because they don't support that cause, but it comes with consequences. And that's what I'm just calling us to rethink about. I think the next point I want to talk about is ideologies. Some people will move to support a cause because of the ideological leaning that they actually have. So for example, if it is about governance, you would see that people who support democracy, if they feel like democracy is being trumpeted in one country or whatever, they may move to support that. If they also think that they support a different ideology and they think that it's threatened in one country or the other, they may also move to support that. So ideologies are also very core or at the center of acting in solidarity, and people actually take that into consideration. I think another thing I want to talk about is people also take into consideration, or if they don't, I'm calling us to rethink about the laws and legalities within either the space that you live in and or where you come from. And this point is very, very, very important because countries, governments interpret laws differently, and a law can be universal, but as lawyers will always say, it takes some expertise to be able to interpret what that law particularly means or what that means. And commoners like me cannot be able to tell. So people need to rethink that. And for example, if you are doing something you think is the right thing and the laws of your government or your country that you come from, if they say that is illegal, then you might get into trouble. So you need to rethink where law and legality actually position itself when you are engaging in an act of solidarity. And then again comes to borders and context. And this is very important because, as I said before, within the digital space, does borders actually matter anymore? And a country, for example, say Ghana, where I come from, does the sovereignty of Ghana extend to me as a citizen in Australia? And if I go ahead to do something in Australia and Ghana feels like that is threatening their image, what would happen to me? We need to rethink about that. And even broadly, also just looking at the context, as in what can we do to support a particular cause? Should we be writing letters, and what is the implications of that? In some countries, sending out letters, putting out your names there may be a very good thing to do. In some contexts, putting out your name there and actually going on demonstration may come with consequences. So I'm just calling us to rethink about these factors before we act in solidarity. Now, what are actually the consequences of engaging in some of the things that I mentioned earlier on? I like to highlight a few as well. For example, engaging in an act of solidarity or engaging in demonstration sometimes can be considered as a civil disobedience. And that is when people actually believe that that is the right thing to do. People can be penalized, people can get fines as a result of that. People can also be imprisoned or incarcerated just participating in that kind of civil disobedience based on the laws of the country or the context. People's citizenship could also be revoked based on their status or wherever they live and their status. People can also be murdered and actually assassinated. And there are several examples that we can actually talk about where people have willingly expressed how they feel and the consequences has been bizarre for them. There are instances that there's physical harm, psychological trauma, and many, many other things. Now, I like to use one case to illustrate these things that I've been talking about. And this particular case, because of the sensitivity of how the global system works, I have chosen to anonymize the case. And that is, I'm not going to use the names of the countries that are involved or individuals that are involved. I'm actually using anonymize it. So for example, I call it country A. And country A has recently had a coup d'etat where democracy has been thrown away. Different countries are actually, or different individuals within across the globe are actually acting in solidarity, even though it is less pronounced in some countries than others. Citizens of the country living abroad have demonstrated and participated in several ways as a way of expressing their disgust for what is happening in the country. And in this, they are actually acting in solidarity. What happens in country A is something that I want to talk about, the action that country A has taken. And that is a practical example of the limitation of solidarity. Country A has actually induced or imposed state sanctions. And how did he do it? Country A actually sent letters to its citizens living abroad to desist from participating in any demonstration that would suggest that they're not in support of the military government, and two, or to give the government a name. And this actually extends to both social media and physical demonstrations. So country A actually did that. And country A also decided to send letters, official letters to its citizens abroad, especially students, that it has given scholarship, asking them to sign the letters that they are in support of what is happening in their country and return those letters by a particular given date. If this is what is happening, to what extent does the sovereignty of a country extend to its citizens abroad? Now, I have a few experiences to share with some of the citizens abroad and how they feel about this approach that the country has, or the new government has taken. And I might not read all of them as it's there and people can read, but a general sense of feeling is that the citizens feel that even staying abroad, their rights are limited, and by that letter being sent to them to sign is actually an indication that they cannot freely express their opinion. And if they do, there are consequences that would come as a result of that. Someone even considered it as bullying, using the state power to be able to do that. And indeed, if you go much into detail, there might not be time for me to go into that. Some of the citizens back in country A actually been in prison and have actually faced a lot of stringent measures or punishment. So what I'm saying is that with this kind of feeling from citizens A, citizens abroad, country A, citizens abroad, what do you think would be the situation or the feeling of citizens A, citizens abroad, or countries A, citizens abroad, who would likely want to go home one day? What happens to them? What happens to their families? And what do we think are the implications if they've gone on demonstration to support a cause, if they posted something on social media as a way of expressing how they feel about the situation? Would this kind of situation prevent them, even if they support a cause, to not go to express how they feel, even if they organize demonstration, or to not even write things on social media, even if they believe in the cause? These are some of the questions that I want us to rethink, and this practical case actually demonstrates that.
Thank you, Matthew. Sorry, I think we can finish there with the questions that you were kind of raising there for us towards the end. Thank you, Matthew. And sorry to interrupt you. I tried to do that as gently as possible, but that was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we had, perhaps you can stop sharing the screen, the screen share, sorry, so that we can kind of see each other. And we've got 26 minutes, which will bring us to the close. So that's still some good time for conversations and discussions. Yes, big round of applause for everyone once again. I'll ask one or two questions while I give everyone some time to think of questions. You're welcome to either type them in the chat and then I'll call on you, or to raise your hands. And I can see there are already a couple of hands raised, but I'm going to use my chair privilege and jump in with a quick question. So I mean, we had 3 really interesting papers, and all of them in a way kind of addressing this question of interventions in different ways, right? So in the first presentation in Akuch's talk, she spoke in relation to, interventions in relation to law and justice, of course. And then afterwards with Dan, we were kind of looking at interventions that are necessary or might be needed in relation to the semiotics of advertising. And finally, we had a discussion around the kinds of interventions that citizens or collectives might take on in response to pressing moral issues, right? In particular. So I thought I'd open up with a question for Aku, and I've got some for Dan and for Matthew, but I'll come to those a little bit later. So just one for Aku, and then I'll call maybe on Daria, who I think put her first was the first to raise her hand there. So Aku, that was really interesting presentation. Thank you. And I wanted to ask you, I think something you highlighted yourself in your paper, that kind of what was really interesting about looking at the family violence intervention orders and to propose the decolonization of this. What was important here for you was to both look at victims and perpetrators, and you sort of alluded to the fact that in doing that, you were hoping to mirror or reflect the earlier violence back in South Sudan. And I found that move very interesting. And it seems to me that that would be something really interesting to hear you sort of reflect a little bit here for us. You know, what are you seeking to do when doing that? When thinking of the family violence intervention orders as something that must include both perpetrators and victims, and in thinking of that violence in relation to earlier violence as well.
Thank you, Carlos. That's a great question, a great reflection of what I have briefly presented on earlier. First, I would like to thank you and Dan. I mean, I've really enjoyed both of your presentations, and hopefully I'll have an opportunity to ask questions later. But to answer the question, I think there is, when we talk about family violence, especially in the South Sudanese community, the literature I have read so far, it's very much focused on the victim experiences, which is the Western way of how family violence has always been researched. And that's not to say that there is no research that have looked at perpetrators, but I think for the South Sudanese community, the complexities that they have been through pre-migrations are really important and do play a role in the perpetration of family violence. And that is something that was really emphasized and brought to light in my previous research before I embarked on the PhD journey. And trauma, the role of trauma within the community was something that was very, very paramount in all areas of their contact with the law and with the criminal justice system. And if I can, this is not me trying to sell my book, but if I can recommend my book titled South Sudanese Manhood and Family Crisis in the Diaspora, I discuss some of those elements of trauma and how that trauma sort of have remained untreated, especially among the South Sudanese men who were previously veterans. And when they moved to the diaspora, that aspect of being a veteran and having traumatic experiences that have manifested in things like PTSD have not been treated and really have been sort of covered by the current challenges that they're facing here in the West. So looking at the role that trauma play and linking it to the prevalence of the family violence within the family, it's something that I couldn't fail to ignore when investigating family violence. I went on for a bit, and I'm sorry, I hope I answered your question.
No, that was really interesting. Thank you, Aku. I'm sure we'll come around to it. So I'll call on Daria, and then I'll call on Gloria to ask your questions. And you can unmute yourself, Daria.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Carlos, and thanks to Kennedy for advertising this conference for me and for organizing it. I'm a PhD candidate at Melbourne Law School and also a migrant I have two questions for Aku and Matthew. The first question is for Aku. Thank you so much for very insightful presentation. I really like how you framed the research regarding like the role of trauma and the role of community in family violence situations. I just have a question related to abusive episodes when a person is a member of a community and this person is in the same household with the abuser, but they are not in a romantic relationship and they are not a family. How do you see the challenges for regulating those abusive episodes, both for the perpetrator and for the victim in the Victorian legal system? And I'll ask the second question maybe when you respond, if it's okay, Carlos.
No, perhaps we'll take the second question for Dan, and then I might also take Gloria's question. Thanks, Daria. So yes, ask your second.
Okay, thank you. Matthew, I really liked how you highlighted the urge to speak up in case of injustice and your reflection on whether it's the right thing to do when you're an activist. How do you imagine the challenges for speaking up in a community of activists if one of the activists has been your perpetrator? And how do you imagine responding to bullying and abusive behavior when you're in the same community, but the other person is in a position of power? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daria. Gloria, could we take your question as well?
I'll just unmute. Hi. So I unfortunately missed Akuch's presentation, which I'm not very happy about after the little bit that I've heard her. But thank you very much. It's been great. I'm from New South Wales, from WSU, so I'm not a Melbourne student, but I'm very glad that a friend passed this link to me. I thank Matthew and Dan earlier, and my question is for Dan and Matthew. So the first one is for you, Dan, is you spoke about organizations not including the marginalized group in the advertising and so forth. And I wanted to ask, so what happens if organizations continue to exclude this group? What might happen? And then the second question is for Matthew, and that is to do with solidarity that you spoke about. It was fantastic. Thank you very much. And I'm from Ghana too, so here we go. I was listening. And my question to you was, what do you think of the idea of allyship? Because that is something that was not spoke about, but that's something that is being taken over by organizations that are now saying that they're going to do inclusion and diversity. They don't talk about solidarity. They only talk about allyship. And I just wanted to hear your comment about what you think of that. Thank you very much.
It's a very good question, both. So I think, Gloria, I think the literature supports the idea across both sort of social justice literature that we've read and also organizational leadership management, that if you do continue to exclude, like you said, these communities from not just even advertising, but the organizations themselves, that it does reinforce those negative outcomes, I suppose. And it is a bit of a paradox, I understand. Sort of, you think if you just, don't do something, that it won't actually have as much of an effect, but it seems to be that negative relationship, I suppose, between not doing something and the negative outcome is actually quite strong. And so I think one of the best articles I read, I think it was about distrust. So when we really decide that we haven't trusted a brand anymore, that came about as a result of people really fundamentally misunderstanding that if they did a bit of work around inclusion, so they actually included 1 or 2 people in this particular campaign, and it was a long campaign across 3 countries, that they would be sort of ticking the box and they could move on. But what they actually found was that the entire community from this nationalized brand moved away from that brand as a result, because it was seen as, quote, ticking that sort of box. It's not enough to do just a little bit, I think. So I think the perpetuation of those negative values is the main concern. But I also see it as being an issue that's quite institutionalized for us in our industry, but across the board too. I mean, you only need to walk into any organization, and I mentioned gender equality on the commercial and corporate boards as having quotas. It's still not resolved there. I mean, women do have a much stronger representation in the commercial sphere, but it's still got a long way to go. And certainly for other people who are marginalized, even as subgroups of the female gender as well. So yeah, it's not great. My advice, I suppose, would be for as many businesses to do the best that they can to be more diverse, because diversification seems to bring about greater returns for companies as well. So hopefully that answers a bit of your question.
Yes, it did. Thanks, Dan.
No worries.
Matthew or Aku, actually, do you want to answer your questions, and then Matthew can come in after that?
Yeah. Thanks for the great question, Dari. I appreciate it. And I think when we talk about family violence within the South Sudanese community, I am very careful to use the term intimate violence. I use the term family violence specifically to include that contact of family, because when we talk about family in the South Sudanese context, and when we look at family in the colonial Western Anglo-Saxon context, they could be quite different. So family in the South Sudanese context could be your uncles, your aunties, your grandma, your cousin. So family is quite large, and it's not as nuclear as the Western definition of family. And I think when looking at family violence, those cultural elements should be included, because they do make a difference and they add to the experiences of the victim and the perpetrators. And the law has been struggling a little bit with the South Sudanese contact of family, and especially when family violence occurs, how the community define it as, who's being perpetrated against, or who is the victim. It can be sometimes quite different to how the law look at it, which causes another barrier and a challenge, and an additional challenge to existing challenges that South Sudanese communities are facing. So that gap between the South Sudanese contact and the law, I think is the gray area that hopefully some of my finding will try to shed some light on. I can't say it's my research only that is going to answer all the questions. I'm sure there's a lot of great research being done out there in the field, but I do hope that researchers that are doing work in the family violence sector and services actually do consider those cultural elements. And like I mentioned earlier, so both the law and the community can actually learn from each other and hopefully come up with better systems and better way of addressing the violence within families.
Thank you.
Matthew.
Yeah, thank you. I think I have 2 questions. And the first question was about what do I think about people who speak up when they themselves are perpetrators or bullies. What was my thought on that? Did I get a question right? Yes.
Thank you, Matthew. Just to clarify a little bit, it's about this tricky question of speaking up in a community of activists when you were abused in this community, and when you were bullied by this community, and the person who actually is the perpetrator is in a position of power in this community of activists? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that is exactly what I'm talking about. And that's why I'm saying that speaking up when you see there's something wrong or acting in an act of solidarity in communities that can be limited. And that's why I term it as bounded solidarity. That person might want to express how they feel, but it's still within the community that they have been bullied and tortured, and speaking up may continue to even have worse effect on them. So what do they do? So that's why I'm saying that in as much as we like the concept solidarity and we are all pushing for it, it's a good thing. But it has dark consequences for individuals found in the context that you have just spoken about. And what can we do about such situations? That's what I was just calling us to rethink about. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you so much.
The second question was my comment or my feel about allyship, and that in recent times, organizations actually act in allyship instead of solidarity. I must be honest that this is still a new area that I'm trying to encourage, and I think I will find it a little bit difficult to separate allyship from solidarity at this point. I think they are very close. It depends on the intent. And if an organization is an ally because they support the cause and they believe that that's the right thing to do, at this point, it'll be difficult for me to say that it's not an act of solidarity. So I think it's more about intent. That's how I will respond to that question.
So it's all go back to the intent of the action. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's really helpful. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Gloria. Michelle, could we have your question?
Hello. Yes. My question is for Akuch, and she's just disappeared from my screen. So hopefully you can still hear me. During your presentation, you gave out a call. It was like a call for action, and I just want to answer that. You talked about joining in with other First Nations groups. And myself, I'm a proud Yorta Yorta woman, and my PhD was in Aboriginal ontology, ways of knowing, being and doing for child rearing and for family structure. And myself and some other Aboriginal colleagues, we have made some progress in this area. We, part of, this has been like a 10-year situation, but we have nodded out with the Victorian government that what informs their practice at the moment is a study completed in the 1980s in London. And that research project is actually still what informs their assessments when working, in contact with all families. They use it as a universal. So what we're saying is that we want Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander ways of, definitions of family, ways of parenting, all of that business to inform in a both ways approach. So you said in your presentation and in your last two questions were around how culture can inform interventions. And in your presentation you said, how can we have a more collaborative approach together? So yeah, that is my question. How do you see that? How would you like that?
Thanks, Michelle. Akuch, just give me a second. I might also take Vincent's question, and then we'll have probably a final round of answers. Vincent, do you want to come in and ask your question as well?
Thanks, Carlos. So my first quick question goes to Matthew. So Matthew, that was an interesting presentation, and for me, it's something that we cannot, conclude discussions on here because we have to continue thinking around it. But like you said, you posed the question, to what extent does one citizenship cross borders, which for me is a critical question to ask. But I would like to ask, do you think that a host country, or a country that is a host to, let's say, persons from other countries, has any responsibility towards protecting the right of those individuals living or studying or working in their countries? Do they have any responsibility at all? And what defines their responsibility towards such persons, to the extent that their original countries may consider in ways in which they treat or handle them. I don't know if that's clear.
That's clear. Thank you, Vince.
Okay, the second one, sorry, goes to Aku. Aku, I'm just interested in this. I know you are dealing with the South Sudanese community, but I also know that there are other African communities in Victoria, yeah? So have you also looked at the family violence or the ways in which these issues are also handled in those other communities other than the South Sudanese? Because this seems to be very unique to the South Sudanese community. But I don't know what similarities or differences exist across these different African groupings in Victoria. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks, Vincent, for the question. I think if you look at international conventions, they actually host countries actually have a role to protect people who live within their borders. And that's where the issue even gets complicated. I think the issue I'm trying to present, yes, you can be in a host country and you can be protected, but the issue is if you do anything in the host countries, that is considered damaging the image of your home country. And when you do return to that country, what happens to you? At this point in time, if you look at how sovereignty works in the global system, every country has sovereignty. And depending on your status of the host country, if you are still the sole citizen of your primary country where you had come from, it is a nation dealing with its citizen. So if we respect international law, it becomes difficult to intervene in such a situation because it is within the sovereign and you are the citizen of the country. And they perhaps just feel like you are one of them and they are dealing with you because you have done something that in their view, they consider it inappropriate. So that's why I'm saying that in that way, even as we leave our countries and we live elsewhere, before we engage in things that we are deeply convinced about, we have to take into consideration the context and some of the limitations that exist in this international system.
Thank you, Matthew. And Aku, and you've got two questions that were just addressed to you. A really interesting point by Michelle and then Vincent's point as well. And I think we'll finish up with you, Aku. Great to give you the last word.
Yeah. Thank you. And apologies, my internet keeps dropping and I'm just in and out. So if I made some of the part of the question, then I apologize for that. I think the first question around how can we incorporate culture and community voices into the existing ways of intervention. I think, and I think that's the beauty of doing a qualitative research. It's a question that I'm going to present to my participant and to the community members to recommend some of the ways that these their cultures could be incorporated into the law. And also having reflect back to my previous research before this research, where I interview community leaders about their thoughts on how to address family violence within the South Sudanese community. Apart from trauma experiences and challenges that they face here, another element that came up was the role of giving the elders and the community leaders the agency to address some of the family violence matters within the community at a community level. And if need be, it can reach the law, and the role of involving elders throughout the investigation process of the authorities being involved and the police, so they can act as an advisors for the police or for the court as an advisors in terms of recognition of cultural practices and also definition of technical things such as what family mean within that community. I think that's the first question. The second was around other African communities. The literature thus shows that there are a lot of similarities in the ways which family violence is frustrated or addressed or ways of intervention within other African communities. However, when we say African, Africa is quite a large continent, and I think it would not be in the capacity of my PhD to look at the whole Africa. That's why I've honed it down to South Sudanese, though existing literature does say that there are similarities in the way family violence is prevalence, or the way family violence is addressed within not only the African communities, but migrant and refugee communities, as they face similar challenges when it comes to understanding of the law and the challenges they face during the settlement period.
Thank you, Aku. And I'm going to jump in here and thank all three speakers and bring this particular panel to a close. And thank you, Aku. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Matthew. That was very interesting. I welcome all participants. I know there's plenty more points to talk about, plenty more questions to raise. I invite you to email our participants and to continue the conversations with them in that way as well, or perhaps to join us for the next panel in about half an hour or so, which is, if I'm not mistaken, on belonging. And thank you again.
Thank you so much, Carlos, for doing a wonderful job at chairing this discussion. And thank you, everyone, for making the time to be with us today. We are taking a bit of a break for just 30 minutes. Please join us back again at 3:00 p.m. Melbourne time sharp for our next session on belonging. That's right, Carlos. So thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you very soon.